Here's a number that should bother you. Only 4 of the world's top 50 technology companies are European, according to the Draghi report. Not 4 of the top 10, not 4 of the top 20, 4 of the top 50. These are companies that define global infrastructure, the platform, the cloud providers, the AI systems that are now being embedded into every sector of the global economy. 4 of 50 are European. And here is what makes that number more uncomfortable. It is not because Europe lacks talent. It is not because Europe lacks research capacity. And it's not, and this is important, because Europe lacks startups. In the first half of 2024 alone, Germany registered 1,384 innovative startup formations, 15% more than the previous 6 months. Germany has now, as of the time recording and the data available, 31 unicorns, ranking 5th in the world. Across Europe, early-stage company formation has recovered. Deep tech is active. The research pipeline is globally competitive. The creation side of the equation is working. So why 4 of 50? That is the question this series is built to answer. I'm Joe Menninger, founder and editor-in-chief of Startuprad.io. Over 8 episodes drawing on primary data from EIB, the Draghi report, PitchBook, KfW, and conversations with policymakers, economists, and operators all inside the system. This series examines the structural mechanics of one of the most consequential economic questions in Europe today. Why does Europe build strong startups, but not enough global technology leaders? This is episode 1. We are setting the frame. And my argument is this: the European scale-up gap is real. It is measurable and is structural. But it is not simply a failure of ambition or execution. It is the visible output of a system that may be deliberately optimized for something other than what we are measuring it against. Let's build this carefully. The European Investment Bank published a report in 2024 titled The Scale-Up Gap. It is one of the most rigorous structural analyses of this question available, and I will draw on it throughout the series. The central finding is precise. By the time European scale-ups reach 10 years in operation, they raise 50% less capital than the San Francisco peers. Not at seed stage, not at Series A, after 10 years of building a company, 50% less. That is not a funding round problem, that is a system problem. And to understand where that gaps come from, you have to look at the architecture of capital, not just the volume of it. Start with the macro picture. Venture capital investment in the European Union represents approximately 0.03% of annual GDP. In the United States, that figure is 0.19%, a 6-to-1 ratio. But that headline number is almost less revealing than what sits behind it. The more important question is, where does venture capital come from? In the United States, the answer is institutional capital, pension funds, insurance companies, university endowments. These pools of long-term capital treat venture as a standard asset class. They provide a structural depth that allows funds to be large, follow-on routes to be sustained, and companies to grow without being forced abroad. In Europe, that institutional participation is structurally different. In 2022, EU pension funds, which collectively hold enormous pools of assets, allocated just 0.024% of assets under management to European venture capital. 0.024%. And this is not because European households lack saving. EU households actually hold a greater share of their savings in cash or highly liquid assets, 30%, compared to US households at only 12%. The wealth exists. It simply does not flow towards venture. That structural difference in allocation has a direct consequence of fund infrastructure. Between 2013 and 2023, there were 137 venture capital funds larger than 1 billion US dollars, of course, in the United States. In the European Union, 11. 11 versus 137. This is not a gap in ambition, it's a gap in infrastructure, and it determines what kind of capital is available at each stage of a company's growth. At seed stage and Series A, European founders can access competitive funding. The early stage ecosystem has genuinely improved over the past decade. But as a company scales, it needs larger rounds, longer runways, more capital, more patient capital for international expansion. The system becomes progressively thinner. The funds are smaller, the follow-on capacity is weaker, and the gap between what a European growth stage company can raise and what a comparable San Francisco company can raise widens with every year. By year 10, 50% less. That is the capital architecture problem. The EU's share of global venture capital funds raised across all fund sizes is approximately 5%. The United States accounts for 52%. 5% versus 52%. That single comparison encapsulates the structural imbalance, and this is why the scale-up gap is not primarily about founders or ideas or execution. It is about what happens when those founders run into the limits of the system they are building inside. So, where do the companies go? Now, look at what this capital architecture produces at a company level. The Draghi report on European competitiveness, one of the most significant policy documents on this subject published in recent years, contains a figure that has become defining in this debate. Between 2008 and 2021, close to 30% of the unicorns founded in Europe relocated their headquarters abroad. Nearly 1 in 3. The primary destination was the United States, and the primary driver was not culture, not language, not regulatory preference in the abstract. It was capital markets. The companies followed the capital. The exit data confirms the same pattern. 38% of IPOs by European scale-ups occurred on foreign stock exchanges, again, predominantly in the United States. So the system produces a consistent outcome. European companies are created here, funded at early stage here, sometimes grow to significant scale here, and then the moment of maximum capital requirement, when a company needs to go from strong regional player to global leader, the domestic system cannot hold them. The infrastructure runs out exactly where it is most needed. This is what I mean when I say the European scale-up gap is a system problem, not a startup problem. It's not that founders are leaving because they want to. The data suggests they are leaving because the rational capital market decision points them towards a system with deeper infrastructure. This is not a talent failure. It's a design outcome. Now, I want to introduce a position that deserves genuine respect, not a straw man, as a legitimate competing thesis. In a conversation I recorded with Thomas Jatzombeck, Parliamentary State Secretary for Digital and State Modernization and one of the architects of Germany's startup policy framework, I asked him directly, where does the scale-up system break down? His answer was not a diagnosis of failure. It was a defense of philosophy. Jatzombeck pointed out that Germany is the third largest economy in the world, ahead of Japan, despite having significantly fewer inhabitants. He argued that the model of the Mittelstand, the dense ecosystem of highly specialized, globally competitive mid-cap companies, has produced durable economic strength for decades, that many German investors are now trying to build hyperscalers. They are trying to build what he called camels, resistant, profitable, specialized market leaders. And he explicitly questioned whether the Silicon Valley model, scale at all costs or die, is actually the right benchmark for what Europe is trying to build. This is not a rationalization. It's a coherent alternative economic philosophy. The hidden champion model has produced real outcomes. Germany's industrial depth, its export strength, its sustained position as a global manufacturing and engineering leader. These are not accidents. They are the outputs of a system deliberately designed to build something different from what Silicon Valley builds. And there is an honest acknowledgement embedded in Jens Homberg's position that is worth naming directly. Germany has also been good at generating the financial returns from the US tech model. As an LP, German family offices are among the significant limited partners in flagship US venture funds. The capital benefits have flowed back just through a different mechanism. So the counter-argument runs like this. Europe has a different model. That model has worked. It produced camels, not unicorns, by design. And the fact that Europe has 4 out of the top 50 global tech companies is not a failure of this model. It is what the model was built to produce. I think this position deserves to be taken seriously. And I think it also has a significant vulnerability. The vulnerability is this. The area we are entering may not accommodate that trade-off. The companies now being built that will define the global infrastructure for the next, say, 20 years are not specialized midcaps. They are AI systems. They are foundational models. They require capital at a scale and speed that the hidden champion model was never designed to provide. And if Europe cannot participate in building that layer, cannot hold its own companies through the scaling phase where that infrastructure gets built, then the dependency Draghi describes becomes structural and permanent. That is the real stakes of the European scale-up gap. Not whether Europe is failing by its own standard, whether its own standards are still sufficient for the world it is entering. There's one more dimension worth examining before we close this episode. If you look at where policy energy is currently concentrated in Germany and across Europe, you see something structurally revealing. In my conversation with Anna Christmann, Germany's digital commissioner, the policy agenda was almost entirely focused on the creation phase, reducing the time to register a company to 24 hours, reforming IP transfer from universities, bringing more women into founding through new programs. These are legitimate priorities. The friction at the founding stage is real, but every one of these interventions is an intervention at the starting line. The structural weaknesses I have described, the 0.024% pension fund allocation, the 11 large venture funds versus 137 in the US, the 38% of IPOs going to foreign exchanges. None of those are addressed by making it faster to register a GmbH, German version of an LLC. The policy attention is at mile 0. The capital gap is at mile 25. And that asymmetry is itself diagnostic. It tells you something about where the political will currently sits. Startup creation is visible, measurable, and politically popular. Institutional capital reallocation, funds of funds structures reform, public market depth. These are harder to communicate, slower to produce results, and require confronting constituencies with significant structural interest in the status quo. So the system keeps improving at what it is already good at, and the gap persists at the point where it most needs to close. There's also a deeper layer here. The policy focus on creation may be partially a reflection of the philosophical position Jens Homberg articulates. If the system is not actually trying to produce hyperscalers, if the hidden champion model is the intended output, then optimizing the creation phase is entirely rational. You want more good companies entering the pipeline. Whether they scale to global leaders is secondary. The question is whether that intent is explicit and acknowledged, or whether it is a revealed preference that no one has chosen to name directly. Because if Europe does 1, to produce global technology leaders, the policy architecture needs to shift significantly upstream from where it currently sits. And if it does not want to, if the hidden champion model is the concise choice, then that should be stated clearly, so the trade-off can be evaluated honestly. What this series argues is that Europe has not yet answered that question clearly, and the cost of not answering it is paid every time a European unicorn relocates to Delaware. Here is where we land at the end of episode 1. The European scale-up gap is real. The data from EIB, the Draghi report from PitchBook, it converges on a consistent structural topic. Europe creates startups. It does not consistently scale them into global technology leaders. The mechanism is capital architecture, insufficient institutional allocation, fragmented fund structures, shallow public markets, a system that runs out of capacity exactly where scaling requires the most. But this is not simply failure. It may be the visible output of a system that was optimized for something different, for resilience over speed, for specialization over dominance, for the camel over the unicorn. The question, and this is the question that will run through the entire series, is whether that optimization is still the right choice. Because the companies being built right now that will define the next 20 years of global infrastructure require capital at a scale and speed that the European system, as currently designed, cannot provide. If Europe wants to change that outcome, the levers are known: institutional capital reallocation, fund infrastructure at scale, public market reform, cross-border harmonization. None of them are easy. All of them require confronting structural interests. But the starting point is clarity about what the system is actually for. Innovation without the infrastructure to scale does not produce technology leadership. It produces dependency. In the next episode of this series, we go inside the mechanism that makes scaling in Europe structurally harder than it needs to be: regulatory and legal fragmentation. A company expanding across 5 European markets faces not one expansion, but a sequence of them, each with its own legal structure, tax treatment, and compliance requirement. There's a name for that: accumulated friction, and it has measurable costs. We will look at the data. But before episode 2, I want to hear directly from someone who has operated inside the system at policy level for years. My conversation with Thomas Jatzombeck covers the architecture of Germany's innovation framework, the DE Hub initiative, the Startup Factory program, and his direct response to the question of where that scale-up system breaks down. It is a position that challenges the standard narrative, and it is a position this series takes seriously. That conversation is up next. This is Startuprad.io. I'm Joe Menninger. If this series is useful for you, share it with people in your ecosystem who need to be having this conversation.
That's all, folks. Find more news, streams, events, and interviews at www.startuprad.io. Remember, sharing is caring.